مستند راز کاستاندا که در سال 2018 تهیه و منتشر شد، دیدگاه‌ها و تجربیات شاگردان و نزدیکان او را گردآوری کرده تا رفتارهای کاستاندا به عنوان داده‌هایی برای تحلیل ارائه شوند. این داده‌ها توسط ناظران خارجی و افراد نزدیک به او برای هر کدام به شیوه‌های متفاوت تفسیر شده‌اند. کانال راهنما با ترجمه و زیرنویس این مستند اطلاعات مربوط به استراتژی‌ها و شیوه برخورد خاص کاستاندا با هر یک از این افراد را در دسترس مبارزان قرار می‌دهد تا استراتژی‌های او به عنوان آخرین ناوال دودمان، فردی که هم رویابین بود و هم شکارچی، در قالب داده در دسترس باشد.
Carlos never worked with a real shaman. He worked with a sorcerer, Don Juan. He told these incredible stories, and we asked him if he could write them down. So he started writing a little bit. And he had a great sense of humor, by the way, a very funny man. We said, that's great, bring another one, and so on. So soon he had almost a book length. Carlos sought me out, and he said he was having trouble with his field notes. He could not figure things out, what to do. He was trying to get a doctorate, PhD, at the University of California at Los Angeles. So he came at a meeting of the American Anthropological Association in San Francisco, and he had heard of a talk I had given in Berkeley at the university here. This was in the early 1960s. I had talked about reality in the upper Amazon and shamanism. The real reality that you enter with the altered state of consciousness, the ecstasy or the trance, and the other reality. And he and I arrived at an agreement that we would call one non-ordinary reality and the other ordinary reality.
I had the chance to meet Carlos Castaneda for the first time in the late 1980s. And this was the time when he came to Mexico to present one of his major works, which was The Eagle's Gift. For many years he had, in a way, disappeared from public life. Of course, the auditorium was packed to the rim, about 500 people waiting to meet the legendary Carlos Castaneda. Time passed by and he didn't show up, Presenter came to the stage and said that he had had some type of impediment and that he had decided to cancel the presentation. So then everybody was very disappointed, and little by little everybody drifted away from the auditorium. But there was a very small compact group of people, maybe 10 or 12 people, that decided to stay, and I was among these people. I had a kind of internal certainty that he would eventually show up. And then after this 4 or 5 hours, to our amazement, Carlos came out and he made the presentation of this book. And then when we asked him why was it that he had decided to cancel this presentation, he said that an important event had arisen when he was about to come out on stage. He had seen something in that stage, an auspicious event, an anomaly. From the sorcerer's perspective, it made him decide not give this presentation and wait to see if a second sign confirmed what he saw in the first place. That specific event was manifest in a person that was among the people in the auditorium was confirmed when that person stayed for those 4 hours, like knowing that he was going to come out. And that person was I.
Well, actually, I only met Károlus Castaneda once, and that was in a seminar in San Francisco, long after he had become super famous. Now, when I went to the seminar, I found him to be very charming, very witty, very entertaining, and I was sure that I had read his book, The Art of Dreaming, before I went to the seminar. It had just been published. And I was the only one at the seminar who had read that book, so I got to ask him some questions about it. And he told us this incredible story about how his publisher reminded him that he owed them one more book. And he said, oh, several years ago I wrote a book about dreaming, but it was so wild I didn't expect anybody to believe it, so I just filed it away in the second attention. Why he didn't just put it in the safety deposit box, I don't know. Maybe this was a metaphor for a safety deposit box. But just it took me a whole week of meditation to pull it out of the second attention and bring it back so it could be published. I thought, well, this is typical Castaneda overstatement and colorful language, and who knows if he believes this or not, but it makes a good story.
The things he talked about were so expansive. I mean, it was like mind-blowing was a very common word that we used. Untold stories and untold marvels that the human being in his expansion of perception could manage, could do. And Károlus was very pragmatic. And after that meeting, it was about 90 minutes, he said, I am giving these practices to start these movements that will help you expand your perception in a local park, and everybody sign your name up. And I signed my name and I went that Saturday, et cetera, et cetera. And I kind of think the rest is history. He made so much sense. His logic was peerless. His reasoning was peerless. His heart was peerless. His intention. He was like nobody else I'd ever met.
I had a chance to spend a day with him when he came to the Bay Area, and he actually specifically offered to meet with transpersonal psychologists. And then, of course, I heard a lot of stories from Michael Harner, who knew him quite well. My feeling is that he had, a lot of non-ordinary experiences. If you read his books, you know that he knows something about the subject. Now, I don't think that all those things that I described there happened, but he was also he's knowledgeable in this area.
So I met him at a brunch at a house in Santa Monica, a very modest, lovely home. He was there with Florinda Donner-Grau and Taisha Abelar. I knew Taisha was with Castaneda at the party, so I said, "What do you do?" And she said, "I do what they do." The thing about Castaneda is that he was very personable, and he was one of the funniest people I've ever met in my life. I mean, he was a sublime mimic. He could mimic anyone, including myself.
Для меня это был просто личный, очень важный этап, который развил во мне, можно сказать, многие аспекты гибкости сознания и способности к восприятию. Чего-то того, что лежит за пределами физического мира. Для большинства людей, как я понимаю, в том числе исходя из опыта своей юности и молодости, просто часто невозможно поверить, что за пределами этого материального мира есть что-то другое, тонкое, и что оно не менее реально, а может быть даже более реально, чем этот физический мир, чем весь этот социальный мир, в котором мы в своих умах постоянно крутимся.
Sometimes we get lost in all of the stories, and sometimes we stay in all the stories, but to actually realize that what he achieved in his books is something each one of us can achieve. I had sat at the feet of many teachers, listened to many stories, but I didn't hear enough of how I could do it. But yet here was this man, Carlos Castaneda, who said, you can do this. You're much more than you think you are. Let me show you the way. He goes, I can open up doors. I can't walk you across those doors. You have to do that yourself. But I can open up those doors for you. That was what he did.
Michael Harner, the great anthropologist, opened up the field that into these realms we've been talking about. He brought to a marvelous meeting at Esalen at 64 a young Carlos Castaneda, a graduate student. So nobody had heard of Carlos. He stole the show. This was filmed. His sheer personality and fun. He sat typically on the floor. He was so much fun, and nobody knew who he was, and told us these stories, you know, about Don Juan. And Fritz Perls got angrier and angrier because Fritz Perls doesn't believe in mysticism or occultism or anything. You know, this was authenticity. And he actually leaned down, he was sitting, and slapped Carl. He slapped him like this and said, you are leading us astray. This is all magic, blah, blah, blah. Because Carlos was telling us how he had taken this datura and put it, and suddenly he was in the bushes. And he said, there I was in the bushes. Did I fly or what? And this infuriated Fritz.
Carlos had two phases of his life. The first phase, when I knew him, he was having ordinary reality experiences in Southern California and adjacent Mexico with a Yaqui sorcerer, Don Juan.
There are shamans who are more focused on healing. Shamanism is about power, using the power from the other dimensions, and it's not prescribed that you should always be a healer. You have to be careful to which category the shaman belongs.
Well, Castaneda was an exceptional individual. He was an extraordinary raconteur, efficient at grabbing people's attention by means of the way he related his stories, anecdotes that accompanied his life, his youth, and his meeting with Don Juan, and then he's turning towards the sorcerer's life. Not very physically appealing. He was small and short, but at the same time he had this amazing personality. I was fascinated with him. I thought he was brilliant. I thought he had an incredibly lucid mind, a great joker, creating this very extraordinary environment around him that was quite magical in nature. He was a person that you never had enough of, no? You wanted to be with him all the time. You wanted to hear him all the time. He was also, at least with me, very affectionate, very loving. And at the same time, he could be very confrontational. And also by means of the way he told you stories and anecdotes in his life, there was a way that he was able to move your attention to a different position. And then there, he gave you certain teachings, very penetrating in that state of mind that he constructed for you in a way.
Carlos Castaneda was very poetic, a very poetic being, sometimes glossed over by people who are obsessed with, was Don Juan Matus real? Where was he from this year to this year? They completely miss the beauty of his poetry, the ethereal quality of what he was trying to convey, which is impossible to convey in words. Impossible.
Carlos was a man. No, he was a Nawal, he was a leader, he was a guru, he was a... Oh my, yes. He was an artist of shifting. He didn't have one identity. Just like if you listen to the stories of Carlos's cohorts with Florinda, Carol Tiggs, and Taisha Abelar, they all met a different Don Juan. There was Don Juan, then there was Maurice Aureliano, then there was Taisha, Abelar, John Michael Abelar. So Carlos had multiple identities. My relationship to him at different times was different. At times, it was the wise person. At times, it was the wall. At times, it was the friend. At times, it was the person that helped me with some of my personal problems. You know, it was the person that I took walks with at the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the most absurd parks of Los Angeles. When Carlos would call us up on the phone and he'd say, hey, you know, let's go do this thing this afternoon or meet you at this restaurant. It wasn't like you knew who you would be meeting. It could be always someone different.
It's difficult to put into words because there was a mood of mystery, great beauty, and theatricality. You know, I'm very theatrical. So the world of Yaqui Indian sorcery, to me, I was home, as opposed to Zen Buddhism or some other kind of discipline that in essence shared many of the same thoughts and ideas and concepts as the sorcery that Carlos Castaneda initiated me into. And Castaneda presented to me a system, a lineage that for me was just a stunning narrative that spoke to my heart. It was the path with heart for me.
He goes, we're going to study anthropology. We're going to watch this film, could be a love story, you know, whatever. And it was like, okay, he goes, this is where humanity is right now. Take note, because when you come back in 10 years, you're going to see another romantic comedy or another thriller or another mystery, and that's going to be where humanity is then. So going to films with Carlos was always an anthropological experience. But I think personally, he loved soccer. Boy, when it was soccer season, it was time to watch the games. And he loved martial arts. He really liked Jackie Chan. He really liked Jet Li. He really liked Bruce Lee. He just had collections. He was a collector. It was always interesting for me, for a man who was so out there, he always took such beautiful care of everything, of his possessions, few possessions in this world. Very respectful.
He talked about himself as an old writer, 80 years old, walking around UCLA with the teachings of Don Juan, saying, this was the book that made me. They called me the godfather of the new age. He would tell me those things to emphasize this idea that it is all temporary. What he challenged was in certain philosophical books called the preservation and maintenance of the everyday self. So he warned me not to become Mr. Hollywood, you know. Don Juan Matus used to call him, Carlos Castaneda, Mr. Nightmare.
He was a great manipulator. I think from his perspective, he thought that by means of always keeping everybody on their toes, compete for his approval and affection, that in this way he could weaken their ego, no? But in truth, it became with time sect-like type of behavior, where the center of attention of all these groups, very demanding and very tyrannical and also very abusive. He was never like that to me, but to the people that were always looking for attention, competing to be part of that group, he was very tyrannical. So after many years of closeness and of being able to interact with Carlos, I had seen many contradictions in the lineage and in his conduct, which doesn't deny his brilliance or his deep spirituality. It's just that after that time, I thought that there was something that was not complete there, and that was not precisely for me.
An American writer, who I won't mention the name of, decided to make a career out of attacking Carlos. Even claimed that I'd made up the Yaqui use of datura to change consciousness, and then years later he apologized in print because finally somebody, I think a man in Switzerland, sent him this reference to this Mexican book on ethnobotany that said that in fact the Yaquis did use the datura ointment in that way. But by that time I had nothing more to say to this man. So Carlos was attacked, but Carlos really didn't care. He was having a great time. Unfortunately, he died very early in his life.
One of the things that people asked me when I met him and began to spend a lot of time with him was about drugs and was I going to Mexico and having peyote? And absolutely not. You know, that period was long past with him. He felt there were other ways to open the doors of perception.
These types of psychedelic substances were only used for people whose mental and psychological structure was exceptionally rigid. When that happened, then psychoactive substances were ritually used in order to temporarily suspend the continuity of the conceptual dualistic mind. It's also important to keep in mind that the use of these types of substances or aids was also very detrimental for self-development. To begin with, because most of these substances are neurotoxic, which means that they do have a degenerate effect in the neural system. They were only used seldomly and for very particular people.
I remember Carlos had a wonderful story when he met Carl Sagan. And so they were having a conversation and Sagan is saying, well, how can you prove to me? And Carlos goes, you cannot prove to me your physics. You cannot prove to me your measurements out there in the universe. I would have to enter your world. I would have to take Physics 101. I would have to understand your calculus. I would have to understand the way that you assemble that reality in order to understand what you see. The same is exactly true of my reality and what I'm saying. You would have to take Sorcery 101, enter and do the tools in order to understand what I'm talking about.
The essential objective of the tradition was to generate a certain collection of circumstances, both external as well as internal, in the individual to inhibit the temporary functioning and continuity of the conceptual dualistic mind. The nature of mind, which goes beyond space and time or duality, or conceptuality, simply arises in a very natural way. In order to stabilize the essential nature of mind, the practitioner needs to develop one-pointed concentration. Then, in the Don Juan lineage, what he needed, or she needed, was personal energy. And that energy was related to our life's events, the way not only that we lead our lives moment to moment, but the way that we have led our lives in the past. So, a second tool that is introduced, which is a contemplative tool that is also parallel to the Buddhist tradition, is the recapitulation. The idea of making a very conscious recollection of one's lives, and by means of that methodology, being able to point to our mental afflictions, egos, trips, all of these places where we invest an enormous amount of energy, liberating that energy, and then being able to regain the totality of oneself.
Это семинар во Франкфурте. Мы стали делать достаточно длинную серию, которая была посвящена вхождению в состояние дерева. В какой-то момент я замечаю, что мои глаза как будто перестают смотреть. Мне как будто бы нечем смотреть на окружающий мир. Глаза закрылись сами собой, а тело продолжает линию движений, которые перед этим были заучены, и мое состояние глубже и глубже меняется, и что я уже не совсем человек. И мое внимание уходит в корни на многие-многие метры вглубь почвы. Я все-таки приоткрыл глаза, посмотрел расфокусированным взглядом в этот зал, и я не увидел там людей. Я увидел лес. Это действительно была коллективная практика. Это был коллективный сдвиг точки сборки. Это была настоящая магия, которую устроили руководители семинара. Это были как бы люди, но на самом деле энергетически в тот момент это были деревья. И это было абсолютно реальным переживанием, не глюком ума. Потом мы плавно вернулись в обычное, так сказать, человеческое состояние. Но сам поход в такие иные состояния, видя и переживая их энергетическую конструкцию, безусловно, давал неоценимый опыт понимания, что наше человеческое существование – это тоже всего лишь одна из конструкций. Она не идеальная, не единственная. И весь набор вариантов энергетических конструкций гораздо шире.
The West Coast editor of a major publisher in New York, they got sent to the publisher and immediately, Nemozhna, impossible. So it came back to Carlus, and Carlus had to wait a few years, and then the University of California Press published it. He still had a good reputation. All right.
69 came up the highway and delivered me a copy of that first book, The Teachings of Don Juan, giving it to me, inscribed to me. And of course, he's so much fun. He's a guy you had to fall in love with right away. Totally unpretentious, but telling these stories, a vivid storyteller. I didn't read the book. So anyway, about a year later, he was suddenly a super celebrity. All of us now started reading. Okay, then the second book came out, and he told more. And the third book. Okay, to make a long story short, these stories, 7 or 8 books, they got more. And then the word came out that he was morphing from an anthropologist into a novelist. But calling himself an anthropologist, he was making it up. And then this was reinforced. Sam Keen, a philosopher and theologian, terrific, interviewed him. In their conversation, he asked Carlos, he said, all right, now the Nagual, as opposed to God, and the Nagual would be something like the divine in his cosmic dimensions or whatever it was. So in other words, the Nagual is everything in this room, but everything in the table. So God is on the table. And he said kind of yes. So some years passed, and now Don Juan is using this image in one of his books. So Sam said he had told him this. So suddenly now he was Don Juan. There were a number of critiques like this emerging, and then of course people started writing books.
He kept us waiting and waiting and waiting, so the dramatic tension was arising until suddenly it was almost like a fair, like a carnival. And he comes out in the middle of the carnival and jumps up onto the stage and immediately challenges. He says, "You think I'm Carlos Castaneda? How do you know? How do you know that I'm not pretending to be?" At the moment, I had a negative reaction. I was saying, who is this jokester? But after a few minutes, I thought, no, he is, instead of talking about his teachings, he is presenting himself that way. He is immediately challenging what's real, what's not real, what do you perceive, what do you not perceive. And then when I realized that, I got more interested in the interview.
I remember the first time I met everyone in his party, so to speak. It was Carol Tiggs and Taisha and Florinda Donner-Grau, Kylie Lundahl and Nuri Alexander, many people. And I was excited and nervous, and I ordered for dessert chocolate-covered strawberries. And when they came to me, I passed them around, just to be cordial. And I watched them go just from one person to the other. No one took any. And about 12 people later, they came back to me. Because, Castaneda was strict about what he put in his body.
Carlos being the new Nawal, the one after Don Juan, he took it very seriously to still lead the ones that Don Juan had left behind, as well as the ones that he was collecting himself, his apprentices he was collecting himself. So in those early days, probably this was 1988, 1989, Carlos would have many phone conversations with me, and he says, I have to go meet the Indians, I have to go meet Nestor, I have to go meet Pablito. They're coming to Los Angeles, they're going to be staying at etc. hotel, and I'm going to be away with them for the weekend and this kind of thing. So in a way, that was my closest experience, personal experience with the older apprentices of Don Juan, etc. But you know, when I think about it, Carlos didn't have to tell me any of that stuff. It wasn't to impress me, it wasn't for any reason except that it was true. You know, he was going to meet these people, and if these people were true and real and had physical form, why wouldn't the others also?
Those that belonged to his generation, I had the chance to meet and to interact with them for a long time, for many years, like with Taixa Abelard, with Florinda Donner. They're lost right now. I don't know exactly what happened when Carlos died, that they collectively committed some type of magical suicide act, something of that nature. But I was also able to meet some of the members of the Indian ancient group of Castaneda, like Doña Soledad. I was able to also meet her and to establish a personal relationship for many years. To begin with, these were Mexicans, so they shared many elements of our culture. They were more related to the indigenous cultures of Mexico, so the way of interpreting the sorcerer's path was more traditional. Then Doña Soledad was not only a great sorceress, she was a great healer. So she was a shaman woman in her own right. She was also a great stalker. She was a teacher of theater at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, accomplished actress, also a very powerful woman. Through her, I was able to meet some of the other members of this group, like Pablito and others, no? And they were very different from the new students of Castaneda, most of them American, that interpreted the sorcerer's path mostly through or by means of Castaneda and not by the teachings of the sorcerers that taught Castaneda. So there was a different feeling in these two groups, no? Very, very different.
Well, after I became a Jungian analyst, I found the Castaneda book, and then I started to write about how to integrate shamanism with psychology.
Yeah.
So that is still today my most popular book.
The Shaman's Body.
Yeah, it's about almost 1 million copies.
Oh,
in
it
English.
keeps going and going and going. It's amazing.
I finished it. I handed it to the publisher, and the publisher said, well, we really should check with Castaneda. And Castaneda said, no, don't publish that. Not yet.
Really?
Yes.
Honest.
Castaneda?
Yeah. And then so I waited. Thank God for Castaneda.
This teacher I mentioned, Ben Thompson, he died some years later after Arnie didn't publish the book. Some years later he died. He was so moved by The Death Walk, the book The Death Walk, The Shaman's Body, that he read the last chapter of The Death Walk, he read onto a recorder, and he had it played at his own funeral after he died, in his own voice. I moved around, I opened the door, I found the manuscript, I walked to Arnie, I said, now you have to publish this. You reworked it, and then it came out. So it was very magical and amazing.
Goes to show death can be a very creative act, too.
He could send energy to people. He had a great sense of wanting to help people. He wanted to free people. He wanted to free them, open up their own doors of perception. He would say, I'm going to send you a ball of energy, and you would feel it. He could do that. He could establish long-term dreams. Now, following the theology or the idea that we are living in a dream, we're living in a dream of our intention, our mind, what we perceive, he could set an intention for a person. Like this person says, would want to go to school or want to go to college or become an anthropologist or become a linguist or something. And he goes, I agree with that. He goes, I'm going to help you with that. And he would set an intention and he would set a dream in motion over a course of years for that person to follow. And that person would. And that person would feel that they were buoyed up by this amazing energy that was always supporting them and always helping them.
Douglas Price Williams is an anthropologist at UCLA, now retired, and he knew Castaneda, and he was very skeptical about Castaneda. And so during one of their meetings, he said, Carlos, I'd like to believe that you have these abilities, but I'd like some demonstration. And so Castaneda said, Douglas, when you get back tonight to your home, write down the name of half a dozen people and give it to somebody and then just forget about it. So when he got home, he wrote down a list of, I think it was 6 or 7 or 8 friends of his, gave it to his wife, put it in an envelope, forgot about it. Some months later, Castaneda was back in town and he phoned Douglas Price Williams and said, remember when I asked you to write that list of names? And Douglas said, oh, almost forgot about it, but the list is safe. And Castaneda said, I want you to contact each of the people on that list and ask them what they dreamed about last night. So Douglas went back and he was able to reach everybody by phone, which was an accomplishment. And incredibly, every person remembered a dream from last night. Even a person who was on an airplane who fell asleep and had a dream. More unusual than that, everybody dreamed about small animals. Carlos Castaneda received this news very casually. He said, well, you see, I sent my power animals into their dreams without even knowing their names. Now, that's something that no magician could do that I know of.
In the sorcerer's way, it's a lot of tricks, a lot of particular circumstances that are designed by the teacher to inhibit the temporary continuity of the dualistic conceptual mind. And when this happens, then the teacher is able to point at the basic nature of mind, and with that allow the practitioner to recognize and stabilize. In this tradition, that's called stalking. And another methodology that is used, that's also parallel to other wisdom and contemplative traditions of the world, and only finds, I would say, the same parallel in Buddhism and the Indian traditions of Mexico, is dreaming, lucid dreaming, no? And with lucid dreaming, the idea is for the practitioner to eventually be able to recognize the illusory nature of dream appearances, detonate lucidity in a dream, and recognize the illusory nature of dream. Then eventually one is able to wake up within the waking state and also recognize the illusory nature of waking appearances. And when that happens, one is able to liberate oneself from the pernicious influences appearances exert over us due to attachment and aversion, no? Which basically arise from ignorance and the dualistic conceptual mind.
In the middle of the night, maybe around 2 or 3, and you go, okay, yes, I'll be over in 10 minutes, okay, sure. He had a little truck, a little brown truck, a little beige truck. He was drive, and it's just like you're barely watching anything, but you're going to these places. And we went to this one place, I loved it. He would say, this is where Carol Tiggs comes to dance. And it was a very lively little dance hall, had a big open door, there was music coming out of it, and bright light, and happy music, and lots of people. And he goes, we parked the truck right out front, and we could look inside. He goes, look at all of that. You could see the band and everything, and it was great. And he goes, look at the sign, and it said Virginia's. It was great. And then he would drive us around the neighborhood, and he goes, this is where Carol Tiggs lived in this apartment, and there just happened to be a light on in the window, and there was a shadow of a person who knows, walking by, I don't know, you know, just shadow of a person. And he goes, oh, look, there's Carol's cat. And then he'd drive us back to home and everything. And so some of us were highly inquisitive if we could find this place ourselves the next day. So we would all band together in our own little car. And I go, okay, we went down this street, we went down this street, we went down this street. And we found this dilapidated old warehouse with this sign that was a kilter or askew. And the only thing you could make out on the sign was the big V. And that's all it was. So, magic? Yeah. He could transport you groups of people through time, different times, different dreams. Again, he was a maker of dreams.
He was talking about dreamers and stalkers and people finding their hands in dreams. I was a complete failure. But my mind was telling me that, you see. I had found Castaneda. I spent 10 years with him. I sat on the bench in Tula that he and Don Juan did when they met the Death Defier. I mean, what part of that is not dreaming, you see? So the idea that you can only dream in some esoteric world, you have failed as an energetic being if you can't find your hands in a dream or fly. No, it's absurd. You dream awake, you see. You dream in the waking world. Don Juan said to Castaneda, you're always asking me about the unknown. The unknown is here. He said the first attention is made from what's thrown away in the second attention.
Для меня в Кастанеде было важно то, что мне нравится в суфизме, это то, что беседы происходили в кафе на бензоколонке, вот, что это не обставлено было какими-то романтическими храмами в джунглях Амазонки, где у идолов в третий глаз были вделаны драгоценные камни. Вот, в этом смысле Кастанеда для меня очень близок, потому что это происходит вот оно здесь. Вот это могло быть в этой закусочной, он мог сидеть на этой скамейке. И вот это вот сочетание высокого и настоящего, потому что есть какая-то идея, мифология, что ничего хорошего здесь произойти не может в Москве. Это надо вот обязательно куда-то поехать, далеко забраться, там какие-то горы, Гималаи, обойти Кайласу, и тогда что-то может произойти.
Castaneda's lineage belongs to an ancient lineage of sorcerers that had the opportunity of recognizing the essential nature of mind, such as what happens in, for instance, Mahamudra or Dzogchen in the Tibetan tradition. But I think what was lacking in that lineage is the whole method of compassion and love. I don't think they adjusted to the Buddhist ideal of the Bodhisattva. They were more people of power, which doesn't mean that they didn't have knowledge or wisdom, but they lacked this element that provided an imbalance in their personality or an imbalance in their self-development, I think.
In one of his books, he's visiting Don Juan in Mexico. Don Juan says to Carlos Castaneda, when you go back to Los Angeles, that I can make a list of everything you're going to do, who you're going to see, every thought that you're going to have. He said, it may be a long list, but I can make that list and leave nothing out. You cannot do the same with me. When you get back to Los Angeles, there's no possible way you could write down one thing that has anything to do with what I am going to do, or energetically, or literally, or in any other way. So that was my relationship to Carlos Castaneda. He really knew me inside and out. He knew me cold, but I knew nothing about what he did during the day or at night. Nothing. I think it's one of the reasons my acceptance of that, my acquiescence of that, was one of the reasons why I was able to stay for 10 years. Because many people came in and out of Carlos's orbit, and they didn't stay. It was difficult. And many of the men were competitive with him. That's how men are raised. To overthrow father, to kill father, to insult father, or to go beyond father, to excel in a way that father couldn't, you see. And I was never competitive because that was absurd.
Well, I think he was somebody that was always looking to make sense of his childhood. He had a difficult, a very painful childhood, and it took him all of his life to, I think, come to terms with that part of his life. But with stories that evoked that sadness, that transformed it also in a very extraordinary way. He would tell you stories for hours on end about his life, no? And with those stories, he was able to drive certain points very deeply into your personality. So we would spend sometimes days and days walking around different places in Mexico City, and he would, tell you stories about all these places and how he was there with Don Juan or some of the members of his lineage and what happened in these places with a great sense of humor.
Is Don Juan real or not? The most important question for me is he was real for Carlos Castaneda. And as we know about reality, there's not one reality for everybody. There's an individual reality assembled by each and every person. So, was Don Juan real for me? He was real for me because he was real for Castaneda. I love what Castaneda said because Castaneda had been in the throes of all this controversy for so many years, and there were so many levels of it. And he says, does it really matter if he was real or not? The point is, this work that I'm showing you isn't mine. It came from somebody, it came from a lineage, it came from a tradition, and the work works. You prove that to yourself by doing the work. Don't listen to the stories. If this work works for you, it becomes your reality. Don Juan is real for you, I'm real for you, I'm your teacher. If it doesn't work for you, go find somebody else.
When I was a small kid, 7 years old, my father, who was an engineer, had a construction project in the city of Tula, which was the city of Don Juan, the village where Don Juan and his lineage lived most part of the year. He used to accompany my father to this place, and we used to go to this very small fonda or little restaurant that was near the park in the square city of Tula. I remember very well that there was this man who was very skinny, but at the same time very strong, who used to look at me in a very strange way. When I was coming out, this man that looked at me in a very strange, very penetrating way rushed behind me, and then he hit me very hard in my back. So I was very shocked. Of course, my internal dialogue, it stopped completely, and in a way I had a glimpse of mind's nature. And he smiled at me and he said, this is the way they will recognize you in the future. And then he left, and I never saw him again. I ran to my father. Do you think that it was Don Juan? Well, Carlos said it was Don Juan, and he was the one that marked me. And that was the sign that he saw that afternoon in that auditorium. And it took many years for me to later on find out that in that lineage, there was a famous Nahual who was called Luján. He lived in the late 18th century, and he was Chinese, and he was a monk from the Shaolin tradition that had come to Mexico during the great migration of Chinese to the West, and then he had arrived in northern Mexico, and there he met a famous Nahual, and then he was trapped and initiated into that lineage, and a fusion between the Shaolin Buddhist tradition and the Indian tradition was set in that lineage. So that's what explains my dual roots, you could say, both in Buddhism as well as in the in that tradition. No, I think it was present in the lineage from ancient times. Yeah, at least from the late 18th century. Because of this Nahual, there was a very important figure of that lineage called Luján.
Obviously had to be somebody back in the beginning, almost certainly. But as it developed over these 8 books, no, it was metaphysical bullshit. You could say that Don Juan is Carlos's cultural construct. There are many Don Juans packed into him. You know, I had this similar experience at Golf in the Kingdom. It's 45 years it's been selling, this book. And it's translated now 2 years ago into Turkish and the constant languages. And so there was something called the Shiva Siren Society based on the protagonist. So then the big debate started. Well, Murphy based that on somebody. So I would be asked, well, you based it on, I said, no, I made it all up. But I said, I know there were seeds of it planted by me watching Ben Hogan practice. He was a great golfer, and he would practice in such a way that he put everyone in trance. So that was a little seed. So I said this to some people, and so the word went around pretty soon now that, oh, Shiva Sirens was really Ben Hogan. So then I had to say, no, wait a minute, everybody. All I said was there was a little influence. So there was finally a split in the Shiva Siren Society between those who thought I just, for whatever weird reasons, I didn't want to say who the model was, and others who said, no, he made the whole thing up. The power of imaginative constructions to take on a life of their own. Like, for example, with my book, there are people who dream about Shiva Sirens. And then I started getting letters, I promise you, of people who had sightings as of a luminous figure they thought was Shiva Sirens. I swear to God, this is true. So in other words, an author can write a character, particularly in this zone, like Carlos did. So I feel I've experienced enough through my own book to know how you can get trapped, and the author should be straight about this. But when you're writing this kind of literature, like, say, Golf in the Kingdom or like Carlos, you're in a zone where people are very vulnerable. So you're playing to a human need and also a weakness. So we should be able to live with our imaginative constructions and see them for what they are and not say they're actually physical people like this.
We know that Carlos's name was written as the author of a lot of those books. And I hope nobody finds it sacrilege for me to say that those books were written also in collaboration with the women. And Carlos would have a joke. He goes, I'm their chauffeur. They run everything. Where we are in culture right now, in order to get this message across, having a male author is going to get more attention.
From what I experienced, I think he used women. I don't think he was able to really love them. But nothing in life is black and white. So I can also not say that he was not affectionate to these people or to the lovers that he had, that he didn't care for them or give them something in exchange. I think he did. But it is true that he also used these people for his own sexual pleasure or the confirmation of his own ego. And most of these women didn't get or didn't receive great benefit from that relationship. I think they were hurt more than they were benefited.
He saw what he was doing as a preparation for death, but not to achieve a peaceful death. He sort of had this image of the afterlife as being like a sort of the cosmic Western, with a lot of evil entities, and he has to be sort of prepared and strong. He didn't see death as an interesting journey. He saw it as a battle that he's going into.
He knew that he would be dying soon. He would be leaving soon. So when I was in the last 10 years of his life, he always had a saying, choose your battles. Where are you going to put your energy today, Chola? And so it was like, he goes, am I going to put it with the sex, or am I going to put it with this? So with me, It was about putting it over here. And I have to say, in being able to teach tensegrity to thousands of practitioners, or the Kárlós's way, the warrior's way to thousands of practitioners, all of whom I have not had sex with, I have the closest relationship to them, closer than to anyone I've ever had in the past. Husbands, love, culturally, socially defined. Expansion of reality, sharing an expansion of reality has no limitation and has no definition. It is something truly magical when you meet heart to heart, consciousness to consciousness with someone, shared intention, and you're exploring the great unknown.
But now Kárlós entered another phase. He entered a phase of his dream period. He decided to live his life within the framework of non-ordinary reality. Things he experienced and he wrote about would be reinterpreted in terms of non-ordinary reality. For example, if he had a bad week or a good week, then at the end of the week, he and a few women that were now his students would reanalyze the week in terms of non-ordinary reality, what really happened. And to me, that was a mistake because he got disconnected from the other reality. So he wrote a number of books which got him into trouble because people could see the similarity of those books to things they'd read elsewhere. He was reinterpreting those things that he'd read elsewhere and discovering the non-ordinary aspect of it.
The third book was actually taken from his doctoral dissertation. And I've talked with many people who know Castaneda better than I do, and they tell me that everything after the third book is very speculative, because by that time he had an audience and he had to write for that audience, and at that time he might have very likely drawn from his imagination, from his dreams, from his, shall we say, borderline states of consciousness. He might actually have believed what he was writing, but in terms of consensual support, it's suspect.
I do think that the lineage of Castaneda was unique. There's no other sorcerer's lineage that speaks in the way that he speaks. I do think, and I know that there are many other lineages of sorcerers in Mexico and Latin America, but none that have that wisdom structure that he generated and constructed for the tradition based on his own education. Based on several factors. The first one is this particular influence that the Buddhist tradition had on the lineage early on. I think that particular addition to the tradition transformed it in its structure and in its outlook in many ways. The second element was that it was a tradition that little by little immigrated into the modern urban environment. Is often the case, kept in rural, indigenous environments. It came to the cities, it came to Mexico City, gravitated on a collection of individuals that were of not Indian stock, but mestizos and more of European influence. It was also presented to a collection of people that had a modern outlook on life, that were educated, at least this was the case in the 20th century, by people like the predecessor of Nahual Don Juan, Nahual Julián, and then by Don Juan himself, and then by Castaneda. So it was a lineage enriched, I think, by the philosophical traditions of the West and also of those of the East. I wouldn't say that he plagiarized these traditions. I just think that he was in perpetual dialogue with this tradition that enriched his language, his outlook, his way of presenting this ancient knowledge. But on the other part, it is also true that I think, at least in the end, this became an element of disruption. Little by little, drove this group of people out of focus. It made them lose their roots, which was not intended to do from the beginning.
In every tradition, including Buddhism, including our own, there was a shift of sorceric power, or the reason or the motivation of sorceric power was, at the beginning, we call it the old seers of our line, was to gain power to command external things. We could command the wind, the rain, the trees, etc., the floods. We could command other people. That was what old seers were about. There was a shift to new seers. New seers are only about commanding themselves, cleaning the ego, becoming enlightened, if you want to use that term. It is interesting to question if the old seers became enlightened in the same way. Because as our tradition tells the story, the old seers were not necessarily so keen on cleaning their egos. They wanted power. They wanted manipulation. They wanted, whereas the new seers, no, we're not about outside. We're about changing the inside. And we affect other people because you change the inside and people notice. You change your being, people notice. They go, you're different. How are you different? I kind of like who you are. How come you don't judge me? How come I can talk to you about anything?
That was one of the paradoxes of being a student of Carlos Castaneda. What he was trying to impart to you is that you must have tremendous discipline, tremendous sobriety to even begin to walk in the direction of the things he was discussing. But on the other hand, you needed to have a lightness of spirit, not a meagerness of spirit. You needed to walk very lightly and not take oneself so seriously.
Видя, что такое эта традиция, нужно понимать, что туда никогда не пускали учеников, которые сами чего-то хотят. Туда не брали любопытствующих. Об этом нужно очень точно помнить. И в книгах, которые написал Кастанеда, это очень хорошо сказано. Они отбирали тех, кто с их точки зрения был подходящим, причем еще под конкретное место в конкретной партии. Поэтому такая-то особенная традиция, она стоит очень в стороне от всех других линий практик, но которая интересным образом дошла до нашего времени и позволяет нам пережить что-то совсем другое, чем есть в других традициях, которые нам сейчас доступны.
There is a movement that is related to the organization that at the last part of his life he set up, Clear Green. No? So some people have been able to participate in the different tensegrity seminars that this organization sets up all over the world, and particularly in the United States. And there's still some people that practice tensegrity and identify that as the main spiritual training related to Castaneda's lineage, which is not. No? In truth, tensegrity was a concoction that he elaborated based on the teachings that he received from his Kung Fu teacher, Howard Lee, and then he simply adapted that type of Kung Fu to his own needs. He designed his own style of Kung Fu, I think directed at strengthening his health, which was ailing at that time from pancreatic cancer. No? And he was able to, for some time, prolong his life by means not only of his diet or medical treatments that he subjected himself to, but also by means of this type of exercise regime. But it is very important to keep in mind that this is not an Indian tradition, as he claims. This was basically, there's no Indian that knows tensegrity at all, no? Or something similar to that. This was basically an adaptation of Carlos of Kung Fu.
The revamping of the tools does not sever the energy of them, the impact of them. This is what I found so amazing, is no, I'm not going to go in the riverbed and I'm not going to use the mirror or something like what Don Juan did with Carlos. I mean, even that was generations before, 40, 50, 60, 80 years before now. That was that generation. We're not going to do that. We're going to do these other modern tools which help us expand, which help us see what invisible helpers open us up to other beings out there in the world. Each one of those tools had energy in them. And I know that if, the business of Clear Green, or if the things that we are presenting, we have to stay in the energy, because it's the energy that moves people. It's the energy of the lineage, which when you go to any event which we present, or anybody else presents it in the name of Carlos Castaneda, who's been trained with Clear Green or from this line, the lineage is present. The lineage agrees to the changes. The lineage comes. They're invited to every party.
At the end of his life, he was bitter that his anthropology wasn't appreciated. Well, I have to say the reason is he should have said to everybody that first book was authentic, because that first book, he had said that to us 5 years before. I believe that, I totally believe he was. But then he became a novelist, and a lot of these Latin American novelists, magical realism. He was a wonderful writer of magical realism. If he had told the world that, he would have been celebrated twice for being an incredible breakthrough anthropologist and a wonderful novelist. Instead, he's deemed to be a fraud because he didn't tell us the difference.
I think his teachings are definitely a great gift for the modern times, especially if you read his books. You will find incredible jewels. I think he was one of the most important writers of his generation. I compare him to Rulfo, Octavio Paz, like Carlos Fuentes, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He would have been considered as one of the great magical realist writers of his generation, no? But since he always said that his writings were real, then he could not be considered in that category, you could say. For sure, there are many elements in his writings that are completely real, and others that are novel, no? That are fictional.
Копают землю и потом раз, и порвали кабель. И вот этот кабель вот так вот вынимают наружу, а там зеленый провод, красный, желтый, в полосочку, такой, сякой, множество разных проводов. То есть сам Кастанеда, он целостный, как некий такой кабель, по которому идут энергии. Но если как бы вот этот срез рассматривать, то там так много всего хорошего, и поэтического, и моральные какие-то есть моменты правильные, какие-то неправильные. То есть каждый человек может на этом, как на оселке, себя заточить. Я видел, что хорошие люди становились лучше, плохие хуже. Он просто дает вот эти провода с энергиями, и ты можешь подключиться и стать таким забавным и веселым, как Карлос. И этого уже достаточно. Или можешь стать таким отчаянным и безбашенным, как Карлос. Ну, для исследователя, для этнографа, может быть, это тоже важно.
Carlos once told me that he saw in Los Angeles on a freeway, on a bridge over the freeway, a saying he liked very much. Death is the greatest journey of all. That is why they save it for last.
I always tell people, and maybe you have to be sensitive, close your eyes, try to get to a silent space, do it with movement, do it with meditation, I don't care how you do it. Call your grandfather, call your dead grandfather. See if you can find him somewhere in the ethos. You won't, or if you do, his being, his energy will be this small. Do the same thing, call Carlos. His energy is like an umbrella. It comes and it will cover you like an umbrella, like a mushroom. That's how Carlos is right now.
What I took from Castaneda was how do we hold discipline and sobriety and this rush towards selflessness with poetry and wonder? And it's beyond doctoral studies. It's beyond the revenge of the practitioners. It's beyond gossip and hearsay, and it's beyond blind allegiance. He organized wonder for me. You know what I mean? He organized mystery for me. I played piano when I was a boy, and classical piano, and you had to practice before you could play the simplest etude. An etude, that's what you worked toward, because there was some mystery, some beauty that you couldn't express to anyone, and you felt you were the only one who really saw or heard that beauty. But before you could do it, you had to practice. You had to practice. You needed discipline. So that's what he showed me, you know. How does one get to that point where one can begin to perceive that this is a dream?
So I don't put down Castaneda completely. I think that he certainly probably did have some unique powers. One has to be a little bit skeptical about accepting everything that he writes about as being literally true. But like I say, we have to give him credit for opening up a field and attracting people to a more, shall we say, a more serious, disciplined, rigorous study of transpersonal experience.
Была или не была эта история в реальности, не имеет никакого значения. Ценность этих книг невозможно преувеличить. И всем рекомендую их обнаружить в своей жизни. Это книги, которые, в отличие от многих других книг об эзотерике и духовном развитии, насыщены реальной силой. Само чтение этих текстов, как их изложил Кастанеда, является практикой, если их читать не как беллетристику, относясь к ним по-настоящему серьезно, представляя себя на месте этого самого Кастанеды в этих самых практиках, переживаниях, диалогах с Доном Хуаном и глубоко переживая эти мысли, эти потрясающие идеи, которые излагал Дон Хуан.
During the years that I had the chance to sustain this very close, affectionate relationship with Carlos Castaneda, that he was definitely one of the most powerful and important and transcendental influences in my life. That it was because of him and his personality and the way that he was able to influence my life that I was very much able to understand many aspects of Tibetan Buddhism that I think I wouldn't have been able to understand that deeply and directly without his help. So he was a very powerful and positive influence in my life, and I was very lucky not to imitate the negative aspects of his own personality and his own neurotic conduct, and I was able to only extract the positive elements, which were many also. No?
His amazing goodwill, his amazing heart, his amazing largesse, his amazing wanting to help. He would always talk to us about how he felt that Don Juan had given him such a gift, and that he didn't want to leave this world without giving the gift or showing the gift or demonstrating the gift to others and leaving the gift behind.
But anyway, he was a very misunderstood man, but he also did not attempt to defend himself. He was just doing his thing. He had his effect. What he did was not teach anybody about shamanism, really. What he did was surprise a lot of people. A barefoot Mexican Indian could challenge the greatest philosophies of France and Europe. And that was the kind of joke that Carlos liked.
one's very versed in what we, the Europeans, stand for. He's not handicapped in that sense. He makes use. He's a warrior, and he makes use of his. He sets his life as in a strategic game. He makes use of everything that he can. He's very versed in that. My effort to make sense of his world is it's my own way of, let's say, paying back to him for this grand opportunity. I think, if I don't make the effort to render his world as a coherent phenomena, he'll go by the way it has for hundreds of years as a nonsensical activity. When it is not nonsensical, it's not fraudulent, it's a very serious endeavor.